I'm Rick Harnish with the High Speed Rail Alliance, and thank you all for joining us today. We've got a really exciting discussion about how to keep costs low on building high-speed rail and other rail transit projects. For those who aren't familiar with the High Speed Rail Alliance, we're a member-supported nonprofit. We help people like you, our members, and policymakers understand why we need to build high-speed regional rail, what steps need to be taken in order to make that happen. And then we give you the tools that you need in order to help your policymakers, state representatives and congresspeople, et cetera, understand what steps they need to take in order to make high-speed and regional rail a reality in Chicago. As a quick aside, I have today a model of a Series O train that I carried home in a suitcase from Japan on one of my recent trips. Just got one. The first person that sends a chat that says they would like it and makes a donation at highspeedrail.org/donate, I'll put it in the mail for you today. But thanks again for coming. It's people like you that make this work possible, so we really appreciate it. Today, we've got Paul Lewis. He's a principal at DBUS and is working on multiple issues on passenger rail and high-speed and passenger rail issues and transit around the country. He spent 12 years as a policy person at the Eno Foundation and dug into the issues of the high costs of building transit during his time there. So Paul, thank you very much for coming. Looking forward to hearing more about this important topic.
All right, thank you, Rick. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and share some of my thinking on costs. Let me just share my screen here and then start the slideshow. Bear with me just a moment. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
All right, looks okay. Okay. Well, thanks again for the introduction, Rick. We're going to talk about navigating high capital costs in rail projects. And as Rick mentioned, I'm a principal at DB E.C.O North America. DB is the Deutsche Bahn, the German national railway. They've set up a consulting arm here in the United States to talk about best practices and implement strategies at stations or at transit agencies and state DOTs around the country. But before I get into the meat of the presentation, I want to start with an example. Right now, this isn't a high-speed rail example. This is an urban rail example. And one of the reasons I'm using an urban rail example is because there isn't a lot of high-speed rail that we can point to in this country, at least not yet. But this was an example, two subway stations, two subway lines that I came across about a decade ago that kind of struck my interest in this topic, right? You have two actually very similar projects, right? The one on the left is the Hamburg U4 extension, phase 1. The one on the right is the New York City 2nd Avenue subway, phase 1, right? They're both about the same length. They have about the same amount of stations. They opened in about the same time frame. They both tunnel under dense urban centers with complex geology, right? There's just the parallels kind of continue. There's a difference, though, when it comes to the cost. And when we look at the cost per mile, the difference between what they were able to do in Hamburg and what they were able to do in New York is really shocking. More than 10 times difference in the two projects. And this is, again, is adjusted for purchase price parity, for inflation, right? Truly shocking numbers. Now, they are both extremes of their peers, right? The Hamburg one was an exceptionally well done and well executed project. New York City 2nd Avenue subway has its well-known problems, but it did strike some interest in me in kind of exploring three main questions, right? One, does the U.S. have a systemic cost problem, right? And the answer to that is yes. I'm going to get into a little bit of why that's the case. What is causing it, right? There's not one thing, there's not two things, there's actually a bunch of things that kind of all work together to erode away at our ability to build things effectively. And we'll talk through those as well. And then the most important thing is, what can agencies, what can we do about this problem, right? And where is really the root of it? And that's where I want to spend most of the time today, is on that. But again, just a little bit of summary. So I joined DB just over a year ago, in part because I want to help address this cost problem. We're come in at a level where we can address the broad governance and processes and standards in which we build these projects to make change. As Rick mentioned, I spent 12 years at the Eno Center. I was the policy director there and published a bunch of reports on this subject. So this is based on dozens of projects, hundreds of interviews, not just in my former position, but I've continued that same project here at Deutsche Bahn. We are going to be making some comparisons to projects, and one project engineer that I talked to in Spain said, if you've seen one rail project, you've seen exactly one rail project. So you can never find an apples to apples comparison between two projects, but the costs do give you a sense of scale, and show you where we should be. And then the recommendations aren't really at kind of value engineering specific segments, but looking at that overall environment in which we build projects. That's really, I think, kind of fundamental to driving costs. So that first question I posed, does the US have a systemic cost problem? Here's some data that I compiled, looking at a couple hundred projects around the planet, mostly in modern democratic countries, on a cost per mile basis. Now, this is urban transit projects, so this isn't necessarily high-speed rail. And this is for primarily tunneled projects, so projects where most of the right-of-way is underground. And you can see the United States, along with the UK, spends an exorbitant amount of money on building tunneled transit, right? This is in that kind of $1.2 to $1.4 billion per mile range. Other countries, such as Spain and South Korea and Italy, right? They're in that kind of $300 million a mile range that you see more typical in other places. If you look at what the US does more of, right? We build mostly at-grade urban transit. In this case, the US does a little bit better in terms of its reversion to the norm, but still 2 or 3 times more expensive than our peers in places like Chile, Germany, Italy, Spain, right? So again, a consistent problem, and what this means is that we get less rail mileage, less project out of our limited funding. I ran a preliminary analysis, so I'm going to caveat this a little bit, of high-speed rail projects. So looking at those projects around the world that have 250 kilometers an hour or more, the average cost per mile. And for this one, I looked at the total right-of-way, because they tend to be much lengthier and more complicated than some of the urban transit systems in many respects. And I have percentages here of the right-of-way that's tunneled and the percent that's elevated. And naturally, as you would expect, the more complicated a project gets, right, the more expensive it is, right? The projects that we looked at in Spain and France and Belgium are mostly at grade, so they're mostly lower cost. The projects that have a lot of tunneling, those ones tend to be a little bit more costly, right? Look at like the Japanese example for a case study there. Again, the Netherlands is a single project, so that that one's not necessarily indicative of their broader environments, right? There are some complications with that project, but you could kind of see the trend, especially for those countries that are well known in building this. US doesn't have a lot of examples, but the Central Valley segment in California is currently estimated to be about $200 million a mile for that project, just as a sense of scale. Some other projects kind of that are on the table that are in construction are kind of will fall in different parts of this table. We can talk about that later. Because more importantly, we need to talk about what's causing it. There are, of course, lots of different factors. I like to break them down into 3 main groups. One is the project governance, right? How are we organizing this project and governing it? The second is processes. How are we actually implementing things? And the third is the standardization and standards piece, right? To what standards are we building this project? And how could that be improved? We could dive into each one of these, and we will, I guess, in some sense. I think most importantly is not to dive into them here on this but really talk about what can we do about this challenge, right? And so what I've developed is a kind of a 10 strategies for project sponsors. This is mostly focused at that kind of state DOT or Amtrak or commuter rail agency, public transit agency level, rather than try to say, to the federal government that you need to change your environmental permitting laws, right? And I think this is because these things here, and I'm going to walk through each one of them individually, but these things here are achievable at the agency regional level, and I think we are more able as people working in the industry or advocating in the industry to work on this directly at the agency level. And I've ordered these generally in what I feel is the easier thing to do to the more difficult thing. So let me walk through them here. So let's talk about building simple and useful projects. Got an example here on the right of a light rail station in Southern California. And this really struck me. As you can see, there's kind of these whimsical brass handrails. And this is an example of customization that is kind of pervasive on a lot of projects, right? These handrails, they look pretty nice, right? But these are going to be a custom design, a custom installation, that's a custom material that's going to require a different type of maintenance, right? And so you're now kind of thinking about not only the cost of installation, but the cost of maintenance. And this is a suboptimal outcome for the users. I mean, imagine if you're in a wheelchair or pushing a stroller on a bike, right? You've got to navigate around this very strange design instead of putting a straight steel standard handrail. This kind of thing is a small example, right, of a bigger problem that kind of boils up into projects all around. We have to get away from overcomplicating our stations and our designs, right, and ripping off and duplicating other designs from other places. So that R&D, right, is a very different type for the transit industry. If you go to other places, the stations will all look the same. They have the only customization is usually some kind of paint or skin on the outside of the station, right? When it comes to tunneling, right, not going too deep, building cut and cover, those kind of things also apply to the design. Number two, this one was really interesting and one that kind of surprised me. The US is one of the only countries in the world that when we're building a big transit line or a big rail line, we put out this big multi-billion-dollar mega contract, right, for construction. Every other country, it's really rare to find a civil works contract for more than $100 to $200 million. Most civil works are much smaller, and this is an example here of the Leipzig City Tunnel. And when they did that, they broke up the tunneling into different contracts. They broke up the stations into different contracts. They broke up some of the ramps into different contracts, right? And what that does is it provides a lot or it provides three different benefits, right? One, you add a lot more competition. There's a lot of firms that can bid on a $50 to $100 million contract. There's only a couple that can bid on a $1 billion contract, right? So that's one. The other is that you have more control over your project's performance. If you have a poor performing contractor, it's very easy to remove them from the contract and award them to one of the adjoining bidders, right, or adjoining contractors. And then three, you have better control over the schedule. If there's a problem, right, you can focus on that problem and the rest of the project's going on. Now, it does require a lot more interface management on behalf of the agency, right? But you're going to have interfaces in projects regardless. And so it's really up to you whether an agency wants to manage that in-house or they want to pay for a consulting firm to bid and manage those interfaces for them, right? And I'll tell you, that's a lot more expensive. I think related to this is the risk component. When we talk about rail projects, I looked at design, bid, build, CMR, CMGC, P3s, right, the whole gamut. And I could find no correlation between one type of delivery method and good or bad project outcomes. And what really matters is whether the public agency itself is assuming the risk that the contractors cannot control, right? And that's a really important thing that we need to kind of get back in the habit of doing, is owning more risk on the public sector side, and understanding that if we want the contractor to assume risk of things that's largely out of their control, they're going to price that risk in. And a lot of the bids that we get that are much higher than expected are almost all traced to not allocating risk in a way that's more conducive to more competitive bids. The fourth one is talking about community engagement, right? I think that the kind of traditional community engagement in the US often doesn't work very well. What we've found works is not having less community engagement, but actually investing in it, right? Not using it as a check the box exercise, but empowering staff, and not necessarily hired consultants to do it, but your in-house staff to engage the community during the planning, during the design, and during construction, the whole phase, right? Have dedicated staff for that, and also empowering them to say no. A lot of times we get in this condition where every community comment has to be accommodated by the project, and that's very, very expensive to do. And we need to get back in the habit of saying, thank you for the comment, we're considering it, we're transparent about that, but ultimately we're going to make it some of the tough decisions at the agency, and that needs to be on agencies to do that. Number 5 is proceed with the more disruptive timeline. What I'm talking about here is, often when we're building transit, we want to make sure that the road stays open during construction, and we want to make sure that we have very limited working hours, right? And this example right here is building the Purple Line in Los Angeles. They were tunneling under Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills, and of course Beverly Hills says, nope, sorry, you can't tunnel during the week because we got to have the road open for commerce. You can only do it on the weekends. And so they had to spend a lot of their time decking over so that traffic could flow during the weekdays. And then in March of 2020, with the stay-at-home orders, the LA Metro and construction firms convinced Beverly Hills for 7-day-a-week construction. They finished this tunneling of the station 7 months ahead of schedule because they were able to spend 100% of their time actually tunneling and not worrying about taking down and setting up every single day. In most other places, they approach transit and rail building with the rip the Band-Aid off approach, and they go into the community and say, look, we're going to be disruptive, we're going to be noisy, it's going to be hard to get around, but then in a couple weeks or a couple of months, we're going to be gone, we're going to be done with the project. And not only is that in the long run less disruptive, but it's also a lot less expensive to do that project very quickly. All right, number 6, we have to talk about environmental review. We all like to talk about environmental review, and it certainly is a time consumer and something, frankly, that every country in the world that has environmental laws, they all complain about going through the environmental review process and how long it takes. And the difference that I was able to find is that the environmental review process is an environmental review process and not a planning process. And we know in this country that environmental review takes a long time, and we want to get to environmental review as fast as possible. And so we don't make some of those key planning decisions now, and we put them off into the environmental review process. And environmental review is a terrible, terrible vehicle for making key planning decisions. And that's why you end up with these EIS statements that have dozens and dozens, in some cases, of alternatives. And trying to find a way to spend more time on the planning and securing those agreements on what the scope of this project is before environmental review makes the process go much faster. Number 7 is boost internal staff. This is a project here in Germany called Stuttgart 21. It's a really amazing high-speed rail project between the two cities that I would love to get into maybe on another webinar. But this is getting back at the fact that in most places in the US, when we're hiring a big project, we hire a consulting firm to come on and be our project management, program management, construction management firm, right? And that's a pretty unique thing to the United States. Most other countries know that the owner needs to be in control of their project. They don't use project management, construction management consultants. They manage it with in-house staff. They use construction firms to build the project, but they do the management in-house. And in Stuttgart 21, this was a fast ramp up of this project. They brought on a consulting firm to do this, right? And they learned their lesson. The project went pretty awfully, but they pivoted and they made a change and they said, no, we're gonna phase out our project management consultant. They hired a pretty robust in-house team with some very much dedicated experts to lead the project, and the project proceeded a lot smoother after that initial hiccup. One of the challenges, of course, with building an in-house staff is knowing it's not just throwing bodies at a project. That you have to be strategic about how you structure that leadership and organization. What kind of resumes do you need to bring in? And certainly you have competition, right? Where a lot of times the private sector pays more than the public sector. But we've also observed that if you give people real opportunity to lead and deliver a project, right, and not just manage consulting contracts, right, you can get people to move for perhaps a lower salary if they know they're going to be involved in those key decisions and doing exciting work. Number 8 is setting agreements with partners early. This is all about looking at labor agreements and, really importantly, betterments. This comes up where you build a project or you start building a project and you need to get permits from a city to close down a street, or you need to move some sidewalk by a school, right? And then the city says, well, you need to do all these other things for us, right? Those are betterments. And sometimes those are necessary to move a project along. It becomes more problematic when, one, those agreements are not transparent, right, and kind of baked into the cost of the project, and two, when those come up once we've already decided what the scope is. In other places, they come to agreement, and for all intents and purposes, all of the parties, the localities, the counties, the states, the labor unions, the transit agencies, everybody who could have a say in the project, sign a agreement at the beginning, right, that says this is what the scope of the project is. If there are things that we should be doing, I guess I neglected to mention utilities. Utilities are absolutely part of this as well, right? If there is a change in the project, if we need to move utilities, here's who pays for it, right? Here's who pays for the base, and here's who pays for any improvement, right? You want a bigger, better water main? Okay, well, we were only going to replace in kind. The project will replace in kind, and you'll pay for your, different material or your upgrade, right? And so those kind of agreements have to be set early, so it's clear to everybody what's in scope, what's not in scope, and who pays for what. And often we don't make those agreements early. Number 9 is addressing institutional governance, right? And this is one of the harder things to do, but a lot of times what happens is we have an agency, take a transit agency, where the transit agency's job is to run buses and trains. And then we say, oh yeah, by the way, go build this multi-billion-dollar mega project. And there just isn't not only the staff, but the institutional structure to deliver a transit agency of that, or a transit project of that kind. And so when we're thinking about a project, whether it's intercity rail or high-speed rail or urban transit, we have to be thinking at the very beginning, who's actually going to be delivering it? Does it have the right board structure? Does it have the right staff support? Does it have the right authorities to actually move a project forward? And if the answer to those questions is no, let's address that early on. In other places, a lot of times they will reform or make tweaks to the governance. And in some cases, they create special purpose delivery vehicles where their sole job is to deliver a major mega project. And then after that mega project's done, that organization disappears, right? We were talking about Stuttgart 21. DB is the owner of that project. We created a subsidiary company, basically tasked with building that project. It had its own board. It was owned by DB, but it operated as this special purpose delivery vehicle. And once that project's finished, we're going to wrap up shop, close doors, and then transfer the assets over to the DB infrastructure owner. And then number 10, of course, is learning from peer country examples. And I don't say that just because I work for DB, but I think in large part, there's great examples of good project delivery all over the country, right? And it's all over the world, right? It's really important that we get out of our comfort zone and spend time studying other projects, talking to other project managers, talking to other estimators, right? People that have been doing this. There's no apples to apples comparison of projects, but the problems that projects face are the same ones in every project all over the planet. And if we can get out of our comfort zone and start talking to people, I think we'll learn a lot from them, and we can bring our costs down here in this country to that international norm, international standard, and we get a lot more bang for the buck out of our projects. So that wraps up my 10 lessons learned. I put it here on this final slide. As I understand it, Rick, you're going to come back on and ask a couple questions from the group.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted by that. That bridge is done. And some people were talking about some issues recently with that bridge that's under construction in your picture there, but that's the going just.
Yeah, it's the Central Valley in California.
My first question is, and if I guess would unshare your screen, but Gateway, what's the official name? The Gateway program. So there's a commission to build new tunnels underneath the Hudson River.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually Amtrak that's going to be managing that project. Am I right?
I have not studied Gateway at length.
Okay.
But that I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. So I wondered if that fit your set up a separate special purpose entity to do it. It was the question.
Yeah, I mean, and to some extent, to the extent that I know, right, as I've looked at it at a high level, right, they set up a commission, right, and it's really bringing together some of those key players, Amtrak and New Jersey Transit, right, and the two states. And so from many respects, right, at a first glance, like the governance of that institution at a board level seems to be in the right direction. But I haven't looked at, whether they have. I mean, that's maybe the top looks okay, but down below it, how are they set up to succeed?
Okay. And that would be an argument, say, in Illinois, to create a high-speed rail authority as opposed to trying to stand this up as part of IDOT or something.
Perhaps. I mean, and the other alternative, and this is one I'd like to explore a little bit, but if you look at highway departments, right, now not just DOTs, but highway departments, right? Highway departments are full of engineers, in-house engineers. They're very good at land acquisition. They're pretty good at pushing things through the environmental review process, right? They've got a lot of experience managing fairly large highway projects. So in some respects, you could imagine a scenario where you don't give this to necessarily the DOT broadly, but to the highway department specifically, and tell the engineers, just pretend this is a very, very straight, flat freeway. And then once they're finished building the infrastructure, we put some rails on. And I'm being a little Pollyannish, but the premise, right, is that we do have experience in governments building good, big things, right? And a lot of that is in our highway departments. A lot of our public utilities do a pretty good job, right? Because they're institutions that were designed and they're tasked with building big things, right? We just had an example here in DC. They built a big sewer tunnel underneath the city at $100 million a mile, which a transit agency could never build a tunnel for that cost, right? So I think that there is something to leveraging existing institutions, but you have to be strategic about it. And maybe it's not the right solution, right? You'd have to really look at it. But examining governance, right? If we're interested in high-speed rail in Illinois, right? Understanding how the governance of actually deploying the infrastructure and then eventually the operations should be a conversation to have right now.
Yeah. So we did persuade the legislature to give the Toll Highway Authority the ability to build high-speed rail. Actually, any railroad, any place in the state. So if the governor wanted to build a spur into a new factory, he could use the Toll Highway Authority to do it. So hoping to give more avenues towards making that happen. We'll go with, there's a lot of questions from the audience. So Chris, if you can go through those.
Yes, happy to. And I'm Chris Ott, the Deputy Director here with the Alliance. And Paul, thank you again for this great talk. Let's start. I apologize if I missed this in one of the slides that you showed, but Howard asks, do you have the cost per mile or per kilometer for high-speed rail in China? Was that on the table that you showed? Yeah.
You know, I haven't looked at the Chinese model, in part because, one, it's hard to find transparent information out of that country. But China also has basically, you know, for all intents and purposes, no environmental laws or private property rights, right? So building there is fundamentally different. And you know, we could maybe look up some cost per mile comparisons in China, but I don't think it would tell us very much, because I don't think that it's a good enough comparison to really draw lessons, right? You can say, okay, they do it cheaply there. We should evolve into a dictatorship. But I don't think anyone's seriously talking about that.
And
Okay.
the scale is so much different in China. The size of the stations, the size of it's all much bigger. So
that's right. Yeah,
right.
They've got 1.3 billion people to move. So they're you know, and in that sense, they can very much justify some of those.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Howard also picked up on the slide that you showed with the you know, sort of custom designed railings, and he asked, many stations include some kind of art, although as you said, that increases the station development cost. Do you have any advice on how to balance station beautification with cost constraints?
It's a great question. So there's a couple different ways to do it, right? Because I think it's art in stations and art in transit is absolutely great, right? You love to see it. What they've done in Europe, right, is you have a transit station and they build a box, right? This happened in the Leipzig City Tunnel, right? This also happened in Copenhagen, right? The stations are essentially a big underground box. And they build it, a big underground box, and then they tell the local community, like, great, you can put whatever kind of panels you want, right? And so they can put these removable steel or vinyl panels on the wall that kind of brings its own character. If you go to those stations, they all look different, right, from a aesthetic standpoint, but it's really just kind of hanging new decorations on the outside. The other way to do it is, instead of kind of from the beginning saying we're going to put these different colored panels on the wall or whatever, is to say, great, we love that the community is interested in putting art in this. Let's build the station first. And once we have the station, you can come in and we can put in whatever art you'd like to. We can put in statues and art, like, and you've seen that, right, on a lot of stations, right? Like take the MBTA. I was there not too long ago. Boston has done a really good job. When they originally built those stations, they were just kind of bland white subway tile walls. They've added in a lot of art exhibits along the way as a great way to kind of engage that along the community, right? So we have precedent for doing that after something is built.
Okay, thanks. And then here's a kind of related question. John points out some recent major overhauls, like the one at Penn Station in New York, and plans for others like Chicago Union Station, and essentially asks, do you have thoughts or advice on whether it's, excuse me, more important to do that or to invest in the track to improve the travel experience?
Yeah, I mean, you can make arguments, right? I mean, that's a value judgment on what you put your money into. Personally, I feel like it seems like we're spending a lot of money on making the station have a little bit more light and look more beautiful, but it doesn't really increase the service or the passenger experience, right? And so one example I mentioned Stuttgart 21. We were talking about it a little bit before this call started with you, Chris, and Rick. That's an interesting case where they had in Stuttgart, they had a 16-track stub end terminal station, right? And as part of it, they moved the station and they converted that terminal station into a through running station, and they developed a whole service plan that increased service through and to Stuttgart. And while they were increasing service, they went from a 16-track station to an 8-track station. So they are able to get a lot more throughput, a lot more passengers, a lot more trains through a station that's essentially smaller, right, with fewer platforms, because they thought about the service first. And so I think a lot of times we have plans for the tracks and then we have plans for the station house. We don't really marry those two. And I would love to see kind of thinking holistically about what is the service we actually want to provide, and then what is then after that the facility that is best to provide it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then Alex asks, have you looked at the return on investment around new transit stations across the globe? Saying it seems that they always seem to induce a lot of building demand. Does that increase tax value? Can you know, any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, no question, right? We know that is kind of a fact. If you have, and it's not just to build a station, but it's really to build service to that station. With transit service, if you have robust service that's well connected in the region, people will take it, and then people want to walk, right? That the number one way you drive rail ridership is people that can walk to and from stations, right? So land use is critical. Building a station, even if it's a quarter mile away from those trip generators, is a huge detractor of trips, right? So you really have to be intentional about where we locate stations, especially if they're new. And there's a couple really good examples across the world where they use land use to fund it, right? I mean, Copenhagen's a great example where they built their city line and connected it to this unused military base and developed the military base. The country owned the military base, and they used the proceeds from selling that once they connected it to pay for the whole network, right? And so that land value capture can really be a great driver of value. Same in Stuttgart 21. I said they eliminated all the tail tracks and the station tracks in that 16-track terminal station. That's a third of a square to the funding the system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then here's a comment that leads into a question. Delays in approving permits by third parties result in cost escalation through delay in payments to contractors and scheduling delays that end up being paid by taxpayers. Other countries, such as Italy and Canada, require third parties to cooperate with rail projects in reviewing and approving designs and permits in a more timely way. Is this something that you think would help in projects in the U.S.?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was getting at that. I think slide 7 I have setting those agreements earlier. We were a couple of months ago in Leipzig looking at the Leipzig City Tunnel, and I was asking this same question to them: how does it work with utilities and localities, right? Because what I think, to restate the comment, is you set an agreement and then you say, okay, we need to shut down the street, and the city says, well, okay, we've got to wait for this permit, right? And so then everyone's on hold waiting for your city permit to shut down the street to do construction. That's one example. In Germany, once you finish your planning, you go through the federal and state planning process, you go through the federal and state environmental process, and it's long and drawn out and cumbersome, just like it is here. But at the end of it, you have the keys to the kingdom, and you get master permitting authority, and the project can shut down the street. The project can enter buildings for seismic retrofits, can shut down public squares, right? You have to let the city know, you have to let the landowner know that you're going into their building, right? But no one can stop the project once you secure those permits, right? And that gives projects a big advantage there. And I think that there's some potential reforms right here that doesn't necessitate that level of kind of top-down planning, right? Because you could imagine the local pushback from something like that in this country, but requiring a signed MOUs about what's in scope, what's not in scope, about the process for permitting and whatnot early in the project could help make sure that the cities come to the table, right? And early in the process and make sure that things are moving forward expediently during construction.
Okay, thank you. Dan asks, in places that proceed with a more disruptive timeline, as you suggested, do these places approach impacts to local businesses differently in some way?
Right. So that's, it's businesses, it's neighbors, right? You got, they can have, just like we do here on some projects, right? You can have budgets to say, look, you own a little coffee shop and we're going to be ripping up the street. And there's literally no way that for the next 2 months that anyone can come into your business. And so you basically pay them to close their business down for 2 months, right? You can do those kind of things. And a lot of times, not only is that cheaper because you can make sure their business is shut down, they're keeping their employees employed or whatever, but you can also get the project done a lot faster so that they can reopen. All right. The alternative is we're going to tear up the street and we're going to try to keep this little narrow sidewalk open, and we're going to have like these signage to make sure that people know that the cafe is open, and it's going to be a 13, 14-month process, right? And then by the end of it, their business is in shambles. That kind of rip the Band-Aid off approach, even if you have to cover some of the business expenses, can be a really beneficial thing to the project and to the business.
Okay. And then this is a clarifying question, and I didn't happen to notice exactly when it came in, but Norm asked, did I hear correctly that project delivery method did not impact cost?
That's right. Yeah. So I'll touch on that again, right? I looked at whether projects, so about 200 projects, whether that was design, bid, build, progressive design, build, CMR, GMC, CMGC, right? All those different alternative delivery. And I couldn't find any correlation between good project outcomes or bad project outcomes and the delivery. You can find examples of both. And what really mattered, right, is whether the agency actually understood what that method was, right? There's a lot of people that get very excited about one particular method, and it's going to be this great risk sharing and it's fantastic. But if you don't manage it that way, then it ends up being really, really problematic, and you get lots of high costs because of risks and lots of change orders, right? The things that come up in projects. And so you really, really have to understand the method you're going about and why you're going about it, and be a little strategic about how you share that risk.
Okay. David asks, do you have recommendations for California's high-speed rail project?
So right, so California high-speed rail project is the biggest, right, capital project in the country right now, and certainly the biggest high-speed rail one. For full disclosure, DB is involved in that project as the early train operator, but we have not been involved on the capital side. And so I don't have any recommendations other than, the 10 things that I list here. I would suggest that any agency be going through those and seeing if at least at first glance they're following those recommendations, and if not, diving into them and trying to explore why not and what can they do about it.
Okay. And then in the chat, there's been some discussion about the political side of this. And has your work looked at political consequences for projects that are very expensive or have gone way over budget or exceeded the timeline?
Yeah, and that actually happens all over the place, right? I've talked about some of the merits and the good things of Stuttgart 21. The project has also been burdened with a lot of cost overruns, right? And some big issues. If you look at the value that project is delivering, I think you can look early, and the estimates at the very beginning were a little bit low. They also expanded scope quite a bit as they do it, so they're getting a lot of value out of it. But that has been a big issue for the country of Germany and DB, right? Is that public perception of, is this project being managed well? It's still, the tunneled sections are, high-speed rail sections are at about 110 million dollars a mile, which is on par with what you would expect globally. So, by and large, it's, I think, performing fairly well, and they're getting a tremendous amount of value out of it. But it sure has been problematic, right? And I think part of the challenge in this country is that because it costs so much to build anything, right? And the expectation is that, whatever, if anything looks reasonable at the onset, it's certainly going to just go over budget. And it's almost like we're kind of preconditioning for that. But it's also kind of incumbent on us as an industry, because we've reached a tipping point where costs have gotten so expensive that we either build very little or we decide just not to build at all because we can't stomach the high costs. And I think we can reverse that. It's not easy, but the alternative is not building anything at all.
Okay. And then Roger in Chicago asks a question which I guess gets at the issue of fairness. And he asks, has anyone looked at the cost of highway projects comparing the US to other parts of the world? And if so, what was the result?
We have not looked at that. I have not looked at that. I don't know of any study that's looked at highway project costs comparing to other countries. And part of the challenge, right, is that while it's pretty easy to find what the costs are for rail projects, it's relatively difficult to find what the costs are for highway projects. Those are just not there. There's, especially recently, there's not as many of them. Highway projects tend to be overpasses or interchanges, and sometimes they're very expensive, but you don't have like you're building a 20-mile rail line type of thing with a bunch of stations, right? It's hard to have more of an apples to apples comparison. But I'll tell you, when we talk, as part of my work, we talk to folks that work in the US highway building industry versus the US transit building industry. And a lot of the best practices that we're talking about are generally followed by the highway industry. They have a pretty robust staff, right? They navigate the environmental process pretty well, right? There's a lot of things that they're doing well, and a lot of that's because they've got a lot of experience doing it. And I think we can leverage some of that experience to the benefit of our new intercity passenger rail networks.
Okay, thanks. Roger also had a Chicago-specific question. Do you know if the Chicago Public Building Commission is viewed as effective at project management?
It's a great question, Roger. I don't know.
Okay. And then moving outward to the global scale, we're all on the same planet and most countries face the same environmental issues. Is there a difference between the environmental review process between countries like the USA and Germany or others?
It's a good question. So essentially, they're the same thing, right? The same idea of when you have a project that's going to create a lot of impacts on noise, on air quality, on fish habitats, right? At whatever, you have to not go for a categorical exclusion. You have to go for a full EIS, right? That is a pretty standard thing in most modern democratic society, all of them that I found. I think in other places, it's a little bit less bureaucratic because there are fewer of them, or there's only one, right? A challenge if you're in California, you've got to go through CEQA and NEPA, and it's often duplicative, and in some cases, it's more onerous at the state level, right? That's fairly uncommon. Usually, there's just one law for the entire country. And I think in other cases, right, that point number 6 that I made, they spend more time in planning, right, which moves things a little slower at the beginning, but it makes the environmental process go a lot faster because they've made most of their key decisions, and they're just reviewing, a handful of alternatives at most. And so it's a lot easier to get through the process. And then in other places like China, right, they don't have any environmental review.
Okay. And then David in Chicago asks a related question. Can you comment on the Federal Railroad Administration's revised planning, environmental, and construction process, which changed after the passage of the infrastructure law?
No, because I haven't. I'm familiar with it, but not as familiar enough that I need to be to get into a deep conversation. So I'll pass on that question.
Okay.
It's a good question, though.
Yeah. And then Norman asks, do you have any advice on how to educate transit authorities about risk, essentially, to divide it appropriately for the benefit of all? I guess this probably goes to one of your points about managing the risk for contractors.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, right? I think the trend for a long time, right, and the perception is like, look, if we can push risk onto the private sector, like that's great, because then we don't have to get bogged down with it. They can manage it, and we're saving the risk on the public sector side. And I think that what ends up happening is you pay dearly for that shift of risk. How do we engage with agencies, right? I mean, some of it is venues like this where we're talking broadly about risk, and we're having open conversations about how the current paradigm by and large isn't working very well. Sometimes it's briefing the board, sometimes it's talking to staff, right? But ideally you have those conversations toward the beginning of the project. Once a project's started and you've established risks and you've signed contracts and shovels in the ground, it's really hard to change those dynamics, right? And so doing that earlier and having those conversations as early as possible is really critical.
Okay. And then let's see, Kobe asking from Texas asks if you have any tips for organizations or local lobbying groups for assisting local county agencies seeking, that are pursuing rail transit projects.
I mean, I think I don't have any specific ones that I'll mention here, but it really depend on the region. And so, I mean, you can feel free to follow up with me with that question. I think my email was on the slides, or I can certainly provide it. But yeah, I'm happy to follow up on that.
Okay. And then I think this is the last one, and a good one. Well, actually, here's one more. We'll do two more questions. This one just came in from Andrew. Do you feel that the FRA's safety rules regarding things like PTC skews the perception of the service and cost that a highway project would be a better use of public dollars?
Can you say that one again? I want to make sure I understand the question.
Sure. Do you feel that the FRA's safety rules, for example, PTC, skews the perception of the service and cost that a highway project, or making it look like a highway project, would be a better use of public dollars?
Perhaps. I feel like generally the public, if you mention what PTC is, they'd have no idea what that actually means. And so I think more is they're looking at, a transit line's $1 billion a mile, and $1 billion is an incomprehensible number, right? And it's also certainly hard for people to realize that they're going to benefit from this if they're not a current transit rider. So there's certain political challenges, but I think other countries face similar resistance to transit, right? Maybe not as vociferous as it is here in the United States, but Germany, you go to Germany and they complain, the people in transit complain about the car culture there, right? They have similar car ownership, but they operate their system in a way that I think is just more convenient for folks, and so more people take it.
Okay. And if I didn't say this already, I guess we should have said, or I should have said that PTC stands for Positive Train Control, a system for making operations safer. And then concluding question comes from Rich. Do you have any thoughts, Paul, on how to more clearly articulate the benefits of these projects to gain more public and political support? Or is there another approach to doing this that you've seen succeed in other countries?
I would say one of the most successful political kind of communications of a rail investment is actually in Virginia. Virginia was focused on how do we reduce congestion, right? And they're not trying to solve a specific modal problem. They're reducing congestion between DC and the DC suburbs in Virginia down to Richmond. And they did a cost estimate for expanding I-95, and they found that it was going to cost about $12 billion to expand I-95 down to Richmond. And their other alternative was to buy a portion of the CSX right away and expand so they could have hourly service between DC and Richmond. And that was going to cost $4 billion. And so it was such a clear, no nonsense, this is the right thing to do investment in rail, right? A third of the cost for the same amount of capacity, that they moved forward with it during the last administration. And since Governor Youngkin took over, right, now a Republican, and some shifting seats in the legislature, they've maintained support for that project, and it's still continuing on as if it's nothing happened. So there was, again, a very clear message, a very clear benefit, and everybody knew that they needed to expand capacity, and this was the clear choice, right? And I think that that's a model that can be emulated elsewhere, right? Providing a very simple comparison of your two options, and that rail is definitely the way to go. That's also, right, that calculation works if we're able to keep those rail costs at a reasonable level. As soon as we're talking about very, very expensive costs, that erodes away at the potential economic calculation. Why it's so important to keep this kind of discussion that we're having here in mind at the very beginning, right? How do we make sure we're keeping costs low in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you for a great presentation, for fielding all these questions. Some people have asked about getting a copy of slides, and I can say that we have recordings we'll have a recording of this talk along with many others on our website, hsrail.org/events. There's a section on there called archives, and we can probably get this one up there within a few days.
Yep. And so I put my email address in I didn't mean to interrupt you, Chris, but I put my email address in the chat, and feel free to reach out. I'm happy to send stuff over.
Okay, thank you. Rick, any final thoughts?
Yeah, this was really helpful, Paul. I really appreciate you doing this. The key question of how do we help communicate this to legislators who then communicate it to agencies is our next big challenge. But it's really urgent that we get more projects moving more quickly, and this is a key part of making that happen. So I appreciate your time. To the audience, thank you for coming. Again, we're member supported, so if you found this valuable and you would like others, please go to hsrails.org/donate. And if you do it quickly, you can in fact have a Series O, the first high-speed train to operate in the world, model that you can put on your desk. So again, thank you, Paul. Thank you to the audience, and we look forward to meeting again.